In classical antiquity, the thought of Heraclitus presented the Greek mind with a possibility of understanding that staggered the imagination of the 5th century BC. His most famous saying was, "You cannot step in the same stream twice." It gave rise to a conception not fully conceived until Plato's time, some generation or two later, but it gave rise to a conception that came directly out of a perception that nature flows, and in its flowing changes, constantly changes. And so the thought of Heraclitus is exactly a Greek complement to the Chinese notion of the Tao. We talked last week about how in the Tao there is no yin and yang. If you are to take a snapshot, a static frame reference slice out of the flow of the Tao, in that slice, in that frame of reference, there is no Tao, but there is yin and yang. The thought of Heraclitus was the Greek equivalent, the pre-Socratic, Socrates being Plato's teacher, so 2 generations before, so that Heraclitus is like a grandfather to Plato. So if you put Heraclitus and Plato together, you get a grandfather phasing sine wave of an energy pulse mediated by the rise in between, which would be the personality of Socrates. Heraclitus, Socrates, Plato. Just as later on you would get Plato, Aristotle, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great being a grandfather-phased resonance of Plato, just as Plato was a grandfather-phased resonance of Heraclitus and one other. The pair to Heraclitus, the other pre-Socratic philosopher who was a pair to Heraclitus was Parmenides. And his fragments are edited here in this University of Toronto press. Parmenides of Elea. Elea being a little Greek city. And so, because of Parmenides' fame, the whole school of Greek thought called Eleatics, which specialized in what we would today, using the Greek term, call paradox. Paradox. Parmenides was the snapshot of the flow of Heraclitus' thought. And in the Parmenidean frame of reference, static snapshot, there was no change whatsoever, but there was the polarity of isness and nothing. Or to put it in stronger English grammatical James Joyce type words, is and is not. Or I like the contraction. I like the Samuel Beckett version of James Joyce. Is and isn't. That the polarity of is and isn't, pure positive and pure negative, that polarity was like a yin-yang in a polarized static frame of reference. Parmenides said what is, and what isn't, isn't. And that they are disjunctive. They never meet. They never touch. And hence there is no change whatsoever. What is real is always real, and what is not real is never real. Plato was faced with this pair. And the whole impetus of trying to understand Plato is his attempt to explicate in an ongoing conversation that was put into bunches called the dialogues, this dialogue, that dialogue, this dialogue, that dialogue, much like Shakespeare's plays. Shakespeare always wrote in a current of inspiration, and the sub-cycles of the current of his inspiration were always tetralogies. Shakespeare always wrote his plays so that they would go in fours. And Plato wrote his dialogues so that they would interconnect together, so that you got this Greek symbol of the meeting of the hands together, and Plato's dialogues linked together in that way. I once took them all and did 27 lectures, there are 27 tapes, on the complete flow of Plato's dialogues, his ideas. The energy, the electric energy of Plato's thought comes from the poles of Heraclitus and Parmenides. One man saying that everything always changes, and the other man saying that nothing ever can change. Now, what's interesting here for us is that the Parmenidean Polarity, the old white-haired sage of Elea, who said, what is, what isn't. Notice that that is and isn't is itself a paired polarity. So that when you take Parmenides as one pole in a further polarity, Heraclitus vis-a-vis Parmenides, Parmenides is already a pair. So when you pair Heraclitus with Parmenides, you do not get a pair of pairs, but you get a pair paired with a singular, because the quality of the Tao, like the quality of Heraclitus thought, is non-polarized in its very structural nature. And so you get the phenomenon of not a earthly square of a pair of pairs, but you get the phenomenon of a celestial braiding of a triad, a triplet. The singularity of the unbroken flow of Heraclitus paired with the pair of is and isn't of Parmenides produced a triad, a trinity, a triplet, a three quality, a celestial insight. And this lines up, I mean aligns, like Paleolithic rock structures, like setting up the heel stone of Stonehenge so that it fits exactly in between the arch of the dozen-ton Trithyllian blue stones that they had to cart all the way from a spot in desolate Ireland 4,500 years ago. The alignment shows the way in which a pair, which is held together, the pair held together, even a disjunctive pair, when held together in an expressive matrix, allow for an alignment of a third quality, a third quantity, a third thing. The resolving third aligns with the space in between the pair. This is very esoteric. It's inescapably important. It has everything to do with modern physics and astronomy. There's no way to have thought beyond 1993 without understanding this. It's essential. And in the West, Plato struggled classically with trying to find some way to make this alignment intellectually. And he tried valiantly with his teacher Socrates as a model. Until later in life, Plato realized that his Socrates as a model had a secret inside of him. That the person of Socrates had a hidden quality within him that Plato, as a young man, did not see. A young man doesn't see such things. A young man is interested in the swashbuckling tussle of the world and winning. And that outlook cannot see, does not see what the mature man comes finally to understand must be seen. And that is a hidden quality. Hidden because the oblique dynamic of the world does not contain it. One has to mature enough to look through the oblique tangle of the world to the quiet space that does not record in the world's things, but records only in the mind when one perceives the relationality is as real as the things themselves. And the perception of the relationality of openness as a trans-ultimate form showed the old Plato that the hidden secret of his Socrates was Pythagoras. And that the true resolver of the Heraclitus Parmenides struggle was Pythagoras. And so in the old Plato, starting with a dialogue called the Theaetetus, developed to almost Herman Melvillian, pure in the ambiguity extent in the Parmenides, and finally triumphantly presented like the grand fugue of Beethoven in his Timaeus. Plato manages to disclose the Pythagorean secret Socratic realization that the openness of the irresolvable pair is the place where the alignment of the resolving third must take place. And in doing so, one gets a relational structure which can be expressed not in terms of cardinality, not in terms of oneness as just one, but in terms of ordinality of one over one. It is still one, but it's expressed in a different way. What way? A relational way. And that relations are as real as things. And that the forms of relations are as real as the forms of things. And that the mind must be kept open, because it's only the openness of the mind in relationship with the thusness of the resolving third of the world that allows for the alignment in a relational way to perceive what we would today call intellectual form. And that without this advance, there is no consciousness. Consciousness is an energy resonance of the reality of that relational form made by the mind. And so the relationship of consciousness to the mind is exactly as I've described. Exactly to the point that one finally has mathematics. If one is limited to counting things arithmetically, then the highest computation that you can do is a mathematical procedure of add and subtract. And occasionally, if you are genius, multiply and divide. But only arithmetical operations are possible. Whereas, as soon as you bring in the openness of the mind and its relationality to the resolving third of empirical things. One develops beyond a transformation beyond the arithmetic to the mathematic, and mathematics is then possible. And mathematics is the language of conscious relational form. And so with Plato's Timaeus is born a development that led to the beginnings of what we would call truly mathematics. The development of algebras, the development of geometries, which culminated about 600 years later in the great time of Plotinus in the development in the ancient world. Its highest level of development was the beginnings of trigonometry. And they were just a generation away from developing the rudiments of a calculus, but they never went that far. Everyone was killed off, the books were burnt, things were thrown away, and nothing vanishes faster than consciousness. She vanishes even faster than the spirit of romance. Because as soon as the profane mind, and what is the profane mind? The mind that will not be open to the empirical realities of the world. The profane mind, in its opaqueness, trying to be something, rather than just being open and letting the nothingness course through, letting the Tao happen, the opaque mind is profane in the sense that it scrambles any possibility of consciousness, any possibility of a mathematical relational form being understood and perceived and applied, and one is left with the regressive dregs of a very low-class arithmetical insistence on things ruling people. The question of souls doesn't even arise. The question of spirits doesn't even arise. And heaven becomes some kind of inflated boudoir with free condoms for all, I suppose. Who knows? Excuse my Hollywood style. It's a travesty against God and the Spirit. And so an education like this is essential to bring out some of the most primordial qualities in the history of consciousness, in the development of human beings, and to draw a certain basic line of understanding of why things are important, what is important, and how they got passed on to us, and how we are losing them daily by trying to grab them with fingers and portfolios that only contain things and not openness. And only the teaching mudra hand contains openness. Only that is the gift of fearlessness to enter into consciousness. Only then is the person real. Only then does the spirit really occur. Only then is there a heaven which could welcome us. Now, what's important about this is that in nature, our forebears of thousands of years ago already understood all of these things, all of these statements. They were not able to tie it with bows like I can here with this language. That's an inheritance of many thousands of years. But the basic understanding of nature was not primitive. It was primordial. And we have to, in our nature section, at least approximate the quality of primordiality that was there at the beginning. Otherwise, our education will have no true beginning, no true traction, because we cannot understand the objectivity of ritual, nor the mysteriousness of language, nor the transformational transcendence of symbols, unless we get nature right. We have to get nature right. We have to begin with nature, but begin with nature as it is, and as it was understood at least 3,000 to 4,000 years ago by our ancestors. Now, I put the initial conversation in terms of Greek philosophy because it's the most accessible, or it used to be the most accessible when there was a classic education behind us. Now it's almost inaccessible because very few people have any classical education whatsoever, and they couldn't even tell you 2 dialogues of Plato. Most people can't even tell you whether Paris is the capital of Luxembourg or of Greece. Of course, it's not the capital of either. When they pass out questions to the American school-age population, and they give people maps, and they're supposed to put in a couple of major cities in the world, 70% cannot put in the major cities of the world, much less know what they are or what happened. So we're living in a junkyard, and we will inherit the wind because the wolves are on the streets already. So this is big time, serious business. If someone is looking for earthquake relief, they better put a couple of $1 billion into education. Otherwise, it's useless to repair the buildings. They'll be abandoned and torn down within 10 years anyway. So let's get practical, let's get real about where the priorities are. That there are only a handful of people who are concerned at all is just an amazing tribute to your perspicacity, but also an indication that there is a pilot that's on. And as long as there's a pilot on, God turns on the gas. It's important for us to understand that when I bring a critical perspective to the materials that we use, I'm not putting down the people. I'm using the best, the cream of world civilization. Anything that we use already is recommended by far. But occasionally I have to introduce a critique, a poignant critique, not to put someone down, but in order to raise our ability to see exactly why the contributions that 25 years ago should have contributed to a profound transformation in society did not happen. And so it has to happen again. There were so many possibilities 25 years ago that I was glad to just be a throwaway, marginal figure among tens of thousands. And now those that are still able to see it, you could count on one hand. Now, one of the criticisms that I'm bringing in, and I'm bringing in another criticism on the Tao of Physics, and it's a criticism of glibness, but not to put anyone down, but in order to show this most important, arcane, yet practical point, that openness between a disjunctive pair is the useful part of that phenomenon. It is the inability of a disjunctive pair to ever touch that allows for the openness, the gap in between them, to be a part of reality. As Lao Tzu said, it's the space of the cup that is useful. And the only reason why this clay, this ceramic clay, is at all useful is that it's shaped in order to include the openness. A disjunctive pair is like that. A polarity is important, not because of the polarity, but because of the disjunctive openness that a polarity makes real. That openness can be aligned with a resolving third, another thing, an empirical object, And when the empirical object is aligned with the openness, not with either pole of the pair, but with the middle way. That's the middle way the Buddha was talking about. What is the middle way of the Buddha? The openness between the disjunctive pair. Where do you think the current of electricity flows? One says in a kind of sophomoric text, well, it flows from positive to negative pole. It flows in an openness which is shared by them and can transform itself. Yes, it can transform itself into the objective object matter quite easily, not only in mathematics, but in actual reality. Matter and electromagnetic energy are interchangeable because of this relationality that they hold. You can write the real matter over energy just as you write 1 over 1 is 1. So that the te of the empirical reality of this or any universe is that the openness of a disjunctive polarity aligns itself with an actual object. To put it in mystical terms, when some saint opens his soul and aligns himself to an actual action, a ritual action, which is as objective as things, the sacred Trinity manifests itself right there, and the beginnings of real form occur in this universe. You don't need anything else. You don't need an operator's manual for anything. You can do that. And that element of relational formality translates into what we would call the real, very directly. Now, it's important to understand that in Chinese thought, in Taoist thought, and one of our texts is called the Tao of Physics. Taoist thought, not yin-yang thought, but Taoist thought. The polarity is yin-yang, and yin-yang never quite touch. There's an openness in between. The yin-yang are the static snapshot of the flow of the Tao. Heraclitus's constant change. Constant change. But whenever there is a moment, wherever there is a phase, wherever there is an objective instance, then yin-yang as a polarity occur and control the shaping of that frame of reference. But it's the openness between them that controls the transformation. The ancient way of saying this was that the is and is notness together form the world's forms, but the center that is not of either is the path by which transformation out of the world to another world occurs. To put it simpler, in much more human relational terms, nature follows a procedure whereby integration happens. The natural cycle of this world is for things to come together. Integration. They cluster, they clump, they align, they have affinity, they stick together. The things of this world accumulate, they accrue, they clump together. And we call these things material. And material is real to us. but the material clumps together, clusters together, comes together, stays together, not on the basis of contact, but on the basis of proximity. And that on an ultimate level, the proximity is on the basis of openness. The electron never touches the nucleus. There's a gap in between. The quarks never quite touch each other. There are gaps in between. And because of the gaps being an actual real part of the structure, all polarized reality spins. Planets spin around stars, moons spin around planets, stars spin around other gravitational centers like galactic centers, whole galaxies spin, galactic clusters spin, atoms spin, electrons spin, quarks have a spin, fundamental particles all have spin values. This phenomenon is the dynamic, it's the motion that is engendered because polarity is related to the openness, the gap, the hole. So that in Taoism, one understood always that yin-yang characterize the frames of reference, but that the frames of reference are always involved in a flow of change. Always. In India, the genius of the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, Siddhartha, his genius saw that there was a complete unconditional openness that occurs at the very center of our human pattern of material reality. And that through that center, one exits this frame of reference for a different frame of reference. You call it the other shore. The language that was used at the time had a peculiar quality to it. He said of that center that it was Dharma. Dharma. And so anyone who concerned themselves with the Buddha would hear the term Dharma. The Magadhi accent of North India called it Dharma, whereas the southern pronunciation down from Sri Lanka, they called it Dhamma. Just like the American South. They couldn't say Dharma, as a good Boston person would say, so they would say Dhamma, as a good Atlanta person would say. And so the collection of the Buddha's sayings was called the Dhammapada. It meant the Dharma path. Dharma. And the ace perfect phrase of Siddhartha, when he pointed with the ideational perspicacity of the mind to the point of penetrating through illusion, he would say, all dharmas are void. All dharmas are void. And in the history of Buddhism, constantly, in every sect, in every school, in every variety, through 2,500 years, the basic underlying number one phrase in Buddhism, all dharmas are void. So that the great Zen koan, Mu, is that form is void, and void is form. It's the essential understanding. But there were many variations, many versions of the expressiveness of this, and one of the variations came about 200 AD, when the Mahayana was beginning to be expansive and colossally gorgeous, and using a kind of a language that hasn't been used since. The kind of scintillating, dazzling, universe-spanning romance language about the yoga of the real. At that time, there were a number of sutras that were attributed to the Buddha because the Buddha was still at the center of the openness of the sayer of these particular teachings. And these sutras had wonderful qualities. They were effusive and expansive. They were like Wagnerian operas to present the staggering, complex gorgeousness of the Buddha's simplicity. All dharmas are void. And so these Mahayana sutras of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD are colossally beautiful, gorgeous operatic works. And one of them was called the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra. In Sanskrit, the Saddharma Pundarika. The lotus of the true law. All dharmas are real. All dharmas are void. The void is real. Reality is void. Reality is dharma. It's a kind of interesting Mobius strip-like tape loop that stymies the logic of the polarized mind and brings it to the inescapable transformation, a radical transformation, that polarities which are grouped together become complementarities in a higher order of expression. Polarities transform into complementarities when they are brought together and held together on the same level as an expression. It's as simple as putting parentheses around them. Yes and no are completely, totally different. Yes, no. Yevtushenko's great poem of being suspended between two cities that he can never get to in the old Soviet Union, one the city of Da, and the other the city of Niet. And he can never get anywhere, because there's no way to close the polarities of Da and Niet. When they asked Yeltsin if he's going to give up his reforms, his reply was simple: Niet. Are you going to win? Da. Yes and no are polarities. One cannot put them together except by the mathematical procedure of putting a parenthesis around them and saying that this yes and no together form this paired, disjunctive paired expression. Now one can use them together as that paired expression in a higher order of form. This leads into mathematics. This leads into the kind of mind that sees relational form as real. And in the Mahayana was the mathematics of the Buddha. And because they used a mathematic of the Buddha, they said then of the old Buddhists that they were very good Buddhists, but they were arithmetic. They dealt with the little vehicle, the little cycle, the Hinayana, the little wheel. Whereas the Mahayana was the universal mathematic transformation. Yes, we need arithmetic qualities to begin with, but it's only a pilot light. And when you turn the fire on, then you have it. Then you have this transformation. In the Mahayana Sutra, the Saddharma Pundarika, the Lotus of the True Law, the phrase was that the essential reality was the Dharmakaya, the Dharma body of the Buddha. The Dharmakaya is the essential reality. But in the historical Buddha's teaching, there was already a quality that went beyond what the Mahayana of the 2nd century called the little vehicle. The historical Buddha was not a Hinayanist. He was not a second-rate monk at all. He was enlightened. And he talked already about the quality of a parayana, a para, way beyond. Parayana, paradox, paradigm, parayana. And he already talked about the trikaya, the 3 bodies, one of which is the Dharmakaya, the other two together are a polarity which hold in the space in between them the objective Dharma kaya. And that these 3 kayas together, these 3 kayas, the Sambhoga kaya, the Nirmana kaya, and the Dharmakaya, these 3 kayas, that is the relational 1/1 of the Buddha. The Dharmakaya being like the constant glittering change. The Dharmakaya like Heraclitus. The other 2 kayas, the Nirmana kaya, the magical body, and the Sambhoga kaya, the radiant body, being like the is and is notness of Parmenides. And in a way, these 3 kayas were like aligning up a singular kaya, the Dharmakaya, with a pair of kayas, the Nirmanakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and making a triad, a triangle, a trinity, a 3 quality, a celestial visionary quality. And you find the beginnings of that in the Lankavatara Sutra. You find it developed finally in all of the great sutras, the large Prajna Paramita Sutra, and so forth. The sutras at that time grew to be, well, in translation, they're 500 or 600 pages. They become fantastic. But in the 1960s and the early 1970s in the United States, there were a lot of people talking about Buddhism as if the Lotus Sutra were the final word, and many Americans who got educated by saying, by word of mouth, by listening to Asian teachers uncritically, were able to say things like we find here in the Tao of Physics. In page 104, in its original sense, the Tao is the ultimate undefinable reality, and as such is the equivalent of the Hinduist Brahman and the Buddhist Dharmakaya. And there's no way that the Tao is equivalent to Dharmakaya. Not ever, at all, ain't no way, never. I can't use my Hollywood Southern accent strong enough to say that it's this precise misunderstanding that led to people thinking that somehow drug trips were going to make some kind of difference to your spiritual questing in the late 60s. It's time to pull the plug. It not only ain't so, it never was so, but the glimpse of a half-truth is exactly what veils the appearance of real truth. Nietzsche once said, "When the half-gods go, then God comes." Let's take a break. A disjunctive polarity when translated out of the ordinal, or out of the cardinal into the ordinal, generates paradox. And becomes an essential characteristic of nature. Paradox is an essential characteristic of nature in a polarized viewpoint. This is a very delicate issue, very formative, especially in Western thought. It did not occupy a particularly strong place in Chinese thought. And in Indian thought, it came in later on. It was a problem imported infectiously from the West, but it bedeviled Western thought. That is to say, European thought, which was Greek-based. The Romans translated, but they never added anything to thought. There are a lot of great Romans. They added nothing to thought. They paved roads, but they couldn't think. The problem of paradox is an endemic flaw which characterizes the basement foundation of the Western mind. And the first mind that formulated paradox in the sense of unsolvable riddles of logic was the number one student of Parmenides. His name was Zeno. Zeno of Elea. The great monograph on Zeno of Elea, done about 60 years ago by H.D.P. Lee, Cambridge University Press. And there's a recent book on Zeno called Modern Science and Zeno's Paradoxes. For the paradoxes of Zeno are not just of historical interest for pre-Socratic thinkers, but they're fundamental for the way in which logic, any logic, operates. Now just consider for a moment. For any logic to operate, there has to be a disjunctive polarity between truth and falsity. The true and the false cannot meet, or you would get ambiguity. And so yes and no, true and false, must be disjunctive, and thus paradox is an endemic quality of a logical system which bases itself upon the clarity of the yeses and the nos, the truth and the falsity. It's like genetically a bug list that's inherited by any logic. So that when Western logicians became sensitive intellectually to the niceties of logical form, in the 19th century, there were a few, and more in the 20th century, but in the 19th century, people like Lewis Carroll recognized that there's an Alice in Wonderland quality that's there in the polarized world that will not go away. A paradoxical realm opens up. And finally, in terms of the truths of mathematicians and first-rate minds like Gottlieb Frege or Bertrand Russell, Alfred North Whitehead, it came to be seen that the only way that a logical system can plug its holes is to have a second auxiliary logical system defining its axiomatic basis, which introduces in practical application a quality of sets of order, which makes mathematics indispensable and points out that the arithmetic mind is incapable of true thought. Always just guesses. And fortunately, because dealing with very limited conditions, a sandbox universe that's not very complicated, the probability of good guesses is high enough that people thought that they were being rational. When in fact, to be rational is extremely precise and very difficult and impossible for the natural mind. The natural mind cannot be precise. You cannot be precise in nature, because the closer you get to precision in nature, the more paradox becomes paramount. One of Zeno's beautiful ways of sophisticating the is and is not of his teacher Parmenides was to take into consideration the new Pythagorean influence of proportionals and relationalities that were coming in the function. Just simply imagine it this way. Instead of just dealing with whole numbers as Parmenides would have done, Zeno dealt with fractions. 1/2, 1/4, especially 1/2. And one of Zeno's paradoxes was that you take the fastest Greek runner, marathon winning Greek runner, if he runs a race halfway and stops, and then runs half the remaining distance and stops, and half the remaining distance and stops, he will never finish the race. No matter how fast he is. He will never finish the race. Not after a long time, but never finish the race. And so paradox entered into Greek thought at the time of Zeno in such a tenacious way that it could not be eradicated or disappeared by any kind of elegant intellectual sleight of hand. It was always there. And forced the Western mind to understand on an intuitive level, to understand that one must transcend a particular horizon of thought in order to escape the flaw that is there. This was the Greek ideational version that became translated into emotional genius intuition in Hellenistic Judaism as original sin. It has nothing to do with unzipping pants or fur or whatever and getting together with Eve. It has nothing to do with that at all. It has to do with the paradoxical inability to bridge a gap in a disjunctive pair. And that man and woman feature as a disjunctive pair in nature is one of the most archaic and arcane and yet primordial qualities. They cannot meet. And yet they do, and the product of their meeting is a child, which is a resolving third for the two of them. But the two of them, without that, are unresolvable. They are a paradox. As recent as 100 years ago, the great Swedish genius August Strindberg investigated this paradox of men and women being structurally unable to meet because they are a disjunctive pair. He wrote some of the most probing books. People who, like Kafka, would be devastated by the full-blown qualities of Strindberg. His diaries Alone and Inferno, his book called Married, takes Zeno's paradox in a human sociological way and reveals what was apparent at the beginnings of the Hellenistic mind, that the problems brought out by the insistence on clear thought bedevil man more than the benefits of a logical tool. When one looks at the statue of a Greek thinker from classical Athens, You see the Zeus or Poseidon-like grandeur of the bearded, full, mature man 200 years later. You look at the Hellenistic philosophers of Alexandria, you see the wrinkled brow, you see the angst-ridden puzzlement. The greatest expression of it came at the very height of the Renaissance, when all of the angst came back. Albrecht Dürer had the angel of the presence of the Lord stymied in front of all the Pythagorean spheres and triangles and pyramids that man's paradoxical mathematical intellect brings into reality that cannot be absorbed by nature. It doesn't fit in nature. It is not a question of a round dowel in a square peg. It's not a question of that at all. It's much more severe than that. It's that there are no pegs. There are no holes. Or either there are pegs and no holes, or there are holes and no pegs. They're disjunctive. It doesn't fit. And in the 20th century, it was recognized that time and space are paradoxical dimensions that were assumed to go together and never meet. They never go together. And only by a relational, expressive phrasing of them in terms of orders of powers of application can they be dealt with in any kind of rational way. Quantum physics is based on this essential reality. Astrophysics works because it takes this into consideration. Molecular biology makes its advances now because this has been understood. From the appearance of Linus Pauling's quantum chemistry in 1935 onward, biochemistry has entered in, just like nuclear physics, to a truly rational understanding that one cannot talk about certainty in nature, but only probability, because the gap quality must be there. It's an essential primordial factor of the real. Now, the great Mahayana Buddhists understood this some 1800 years ago and developed a three-value logic to take care of this. There's not only yes and no, but there's a neutral. Not a maybe neutral, but a neutral where neither yes nor no. But that neutral is itself esoterically paired. It's a neutral where it's neither. At the same time, it is a neutral where it's both. And so the 1960s phrase, when people first started in the West, in this country, in this state, first started hearing this from Asian masters that should have been a little more circumspect about their population of students, they climbed on the both-and bandwagon. Big drums, it's not only a yes and no world, but it's a both-and world. And you have wonderful productions where you see the Tai Chi, you see the yin-yang. But what you don't see is what is really operative here, and that is the Tao that does not show up on the diagrams, but shows up all the time in the paradoxical nature of reality. Nature of reality. And in a converse way, consciousness sees that the reality of nature also is this way, but one can only see that retrospectively from consciousness, and when you're in the natural cycle, there is no way to see it. It is so endemic that it is the very background that allows all the forms, even relational forms, to exist and occur. And only after a radical transformation does one, using the Vajrayana term, learn to see that seeing itself is a clear light. Only then does one understand in retrospect. And that one can see that seeing itself was a kind of a sight. The Scots had a beautiful phrase that they used to use 300 years ago, and part of my ancestry was still roaming, probably nude, the wild moors of the highlands. Doesn't want to record my ancestry. Roaming nude up above Loch Ness. They called it second sight. They said that some people were gifted with second sight. That means to say that they didn't see just the world, but they saw the seeing of the world. They saw the seeing of the world. So that one puts the seeing and the world, which are a conjunctive polarity, into a set that second sight governs. It's like a square of perception. Second sight is perception squared. This kind of quality led the Scottish mind to approximate about 200 years ago, 250 years ago, after a generation or so of beginning to think about second sight, it led to the Scottish mind, using the English language with a Scottish mind, to understand that what seems to be a constant, consistent flow of the spectrum of nature is interrupted. And the great thinker, the great Scottish thinker who thought this, David Hume, showed by exact experiment that there is no way that nature is a consistent ribbon of materiality. It is punctuated here and there. It wasn't apparent to him how radically ordered the punctuation was, but he saw that reality, the reality of materiality, was disjunctive in its nature, in its primordiality. And so in Hume's great treatise on human nature, one finds the kind of perspicacity that was there in the great logicians of the Mahayana, in the quality that was there in the Taoists of, say, the 3rd century BC, the time of Chuang-Tzu. If you remember the little story that I told about the Taoist butcher who cut up many oxen and whose knife was always sharp, and when the emperor asked him, why is it that these other butchers, when they cut just a portion of an oxen, their knives have to be sharpened time and time again, and yet you have cut dozens of oxen and your knife never needs sharpening. How is this so? And the Chuang-Tzu butcher said, the other men cut the meat. They cut the bones. They cut the sinews, and that dulls their knife. I, on the other hand, cut in between the joints. I never touch the bones. I never touch the meat or the sinews, and my knife obviously will not need sharpening. He cuts through the gap that runs like a truthful lightning through the supposedly bland material of this world. So that the essence of transformation is through the gap and not through the material. You cannot change material to some other material without first dissolving this material into its gappedness and rematerializing its gappedness as another material. So that transformation needs to have that middle, neutral, both and openness in order to succeed. Otherwise, nothing really transforms. And all you get is a mechanical redistribution. It's like a maddening game. It's like a tabletop full of ball bearings, and you can move the ball bearings around indefinitely, but they're always just ball bearings on a table. There is no transformation. There's only mechanical manipulation. And most human governments that have been set up are mechanical manipulation of things. And there are no conscious spiritual beings that are ever going to be perceivable, much less developable in those kinds of terms. That kind of politics is as out of date as inorganic chemistry would be for organic individuals. It's a slopsistic kind of flaw that is endemic and has weeded itself insidiously so that there's no possibility whatsoever. But we will not have governments of human beings who are spiritual persons until we work at it. We have to work at it. And to work at it, we have to have some kind of education so that there's a population of people who understand not only what they're doing, but what there is to do and how to do it. And that kind of practical teaching has to be done now. Otherwise, it'll take 4,000 or 5,000 years to get back to this level of opportunity. We have to cut in between the polarities. We have to use the space of the cup in order to drink. And so, in an education that bases itself on nature, we cannot be so blandly naive as to think that material things are what is real. Or just to make some kind of mechanical redistribution and say that by naming such things, that then we have a handle on what they are, and by changing the names, thereby the things are changed. This is a projective neurosis, and in fact is one of the root causes of the neurotic outlook. A rose by any other name is still a rose. You can convince yourself that it's not, hypnotically. You can convince someone hypnotically that a rose is a snake. But it does not alter the flower. It alters only the perception, which is a mechanical redistribution on the ball-bearing single tabletop level. You could take 5 tons of LSD. It doesn't alter consciousness at all. It just redistributes perception in nice French marble swirls that are not even decorative after a while. To the clear mind, they're a nuisance. An education that works must found itself on nature, not on skepticism. The David Hume skepticism is a conclusion that one can come to after examining a false set of conditions that have been insisted upon. Hume skepticism is a very fine way to arrive at a ticking off and a rejection of a flawed outlook, but it's not a beginning. Only nature is our beginning. We have to begin where we are and have some way of generating a sense of our participation in the real. Now this movement, this spinning that is caused, all polarities cause a spin. And all spins, because of the polar nature of its dynamic, all spins have certain cycle, a vibrational cycle, vibrational tone. And things that spin with the same vibration echo together. The famous example of this is from music. If we had 100 violins laying around this room, and the beautiful, elegant, phantasmal, intense ghost of Jascha Heifetz came in and played a middle C note on his violin, all of the violins would reverberate to middle C. They would all play the middle C just like Jascha Heifetz plays it. there would be no second-rate middle Cs on those other violins. They all vibrate to the same vibrational tone, and the vibrational tone carries the individual, stylistic, personal quality to it. But one has to understand that this is how it works. You can feed 5,000 people with a single fish if you understand the vibrational consonants of the real. It was done once upon a time in northern Israel. It was called Israel then, too. Not Judea, but Israel. There were two kingdoms. What's important here for us to understand in nature is that vibration, resonance, takes the shape if the energy is put in the gap, in the center, in between the polarities. And that energy grounds itself on something empirically, objectively real, not just things like stuff, but upon actions, because action is just as real as material objects. Action in a relationality brings out the triadic quality of the plane of the real. And so literally, a human civilization, as well as a human culture, is founded upon the good deed. One of the archetypal words that constantly appears in Zarathustra's Gathas some 4,000 years ago translates as good deeds. Good deeds. And that when one understands that the good deed is as real as the truthful object, then a language founded upon that fount of certainty becomes the good word. And one sees in the Gathas of Zarathustra 42 centuries ago already, the sage who does the good deed can then speak the truth. And speaking the truth, the population that hears him becomes the community of truth. Because they then vibrate to the resonance of his word. And that's why in the battle against ignorance, it only takes one true teacher. The true teacher is indispensable. And one doesn't really need a committee. Our sense of nature, our sense of founding our whole educational cycle, the educational cycle, the energy vibration, which leads to integration, coming to the point of realization in the place of the openness. That's what our whole first year is about. If integration does not culminate in openness, then whatever it culminates in will be a false idol, a graven image. And in the old Mosaic assessment of it, whenever there is a graven image in the mind of man, he will never be able to experience God. When the half-gods are there, there's no way that God can be appreciated. And the radiance of the Shekinah will not be there. She will not come. Not to a mind dirtied by the cheap tinfoil of false dreams. She is too elegant for that. Nothing to do with this. This quality of nature is primordial. What is the quality? That the openness between disjunctive polarities is the transformational trigger by which complementarities are made and higher orders of cycles of vibrational resonance occur. That's a lot to say in one sentence, but that is pretty much a principle. It's a universal principle. It is literally the way things work. It's why anything works in this universe, because of this particular principle. And it's important to keep our awakenedness, to try to inhabit the consciousness of this particular awareness. Our complement to the Tao of Physics is Galaxies by Timothy Ferris. And I want to just point out, because we're running out of time today, and we'll come back tomorrow, next week, the next session, we'll come back and begin with Galaxies. I'd like to point out that galaxies themselves are like whirling structures of celestial grandeur. One of the greatest and most profound of all the mystics in the Western tradition was a man whose real name is not known. Most of the really great figures in the Western tradition are always unknown, because by the time one reaches the understanding appropriate to reality, the fact that whatever name one bore is really irrelevant to one's thusness, one's there-ness. He is called Dionysius the Areopagite, lived about 500 AD. And in his deep mystical intuition of God's realm, of heaven, he saw angels of light whirling in the midst of immense velvety blackness. And it's the perfect description, some 1,500 years ago, of what an astronomer sees when he looks in a telescope and sees galactic structures. Now, most of the presentation of galaxies in the last 60 years, and that's about how long they've been consciously available in an empirical way, most of the presentation of galaxies are done through photographs. But the artifactual nature of photographs reduces down the profound reality of a galaxy to the iconography of viewing a photograph. And the photographs of galactic structures, like in Timothy Ferris's book, one can see a galactic structure. Let's pick one out that is familiar. Plate 48. A photograph of a galaxy is artifactually misleading. It's beautiful to see it, it's necessary to see it, but it's necessary also to know that what one is looking at is a photograph and not a galaxy. And very rarely now do astronomers look through a telescope lens with their own eye and see the presence of the real of a galaxy. That is a different experience. That is an extraordinary experience. If one looks with the organic eye through a telescope like Galileo some 400 years ago, and sees for the first time, he saw the 4 largest moons of Jupiter going around Jupiter. He developed an instant understanding, an instant appreciation for the clockwork-like regularity of the universe. Not that the universe is clockwork-like or even regular, but that its intuitive certainty is that whatever odd movements there are in the universe as a whole, there is a regularity. That the wholeness of the universe is a regularity. And not only did it occur to Galileo through his eye, but it occurred to a mathematician like Kepler through his mind. That even though there may not be a precision to any one aspect of the movement, the symphony of the movements as a whole is consonant and is regular. And this is what a galaxy is. A galaxy is the consistent wholeness of all of the star systems in a characteristic family. And so the spiral galaxy is, for our time, the new symbol of wholeness. The whirling spiral is the new integrating operative symbol for wholeness for the next 2,000 years. So this whirling spiral will be our guardian spirit for the next 20 centuries. Will be that quality of tutorial guardian spirit inviting us out into an ever larger expanse. The nuclear version of the galaxy is the star system. The atom of the organism of a galaxy is a star system. And so a star system will become the new basis upon which the concept of home will be founded. If we can make the educational adjustment in the next 20 years, we'll do so. Otherwise, this will be archaic ancient history by the time it's ever used. We will consider a star system a home, or we will be back into our caves, mentally speaking. The whole principle of following nature is to realize that the openness is as objectively real as the things, and that the thingness always occurs in pairedness, and that the pairedness in a static frozen snapshot occur as positive, negative, but in the living appreciation, one sees the mystery of the ongoing, scintillating change, and that this ongoing, scintillating ribbon of change is punctuated in an ordinal pattern of mysteriousness by non-occurrence. That change is punctuated by moments of nothingness. And that the moment of nothingness does not stop the fluid continuity of change at all. Change occurs just as if the nothingness had not happened, and the nothingness does not occur just as if no change was taking place whatsoever. So that in a fluid form, when yin-yang are together, they are like the Tai Chi. This is the fluid form. This is the I Ching form of yin-yang. But when there is a manifestation in terms of some objective thing, things are like a snapshot. It occurs as if the polarities were like electrical poles of positive and negative. If one takes the mechanical distribution view, one will always misunderstand the real. Someone who does Chinese medicine by the meridians and thinks that there are points along these meridians, this is a mechanic's view. A real Taoist doctor understands that it is the movement of the Tao through the openness that is efficacious in the transformations. And if you want to bring health back, you bring it back through what is not there, not through what is there. And to a real Taoist doctor, the meridians do not exist, and that's why they're real. And that's why they can be touched, not by the hand that grasps, but by the hand that accepts the openness. And a real healer, somebody on the level of a Job, is healed by the laying on of the hands in terms of acceptance and not manipulation. We'll have more on this next week.